Hello, Eustis Middle School. Today for First Chapter Friday, I'm going to be sharing one of my favorite authors, Roald Dahl and Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. This name might sound familiar because he is in the 6th grade curriculum this year. He writes a lot of amazing books, and this one was one of my favorites growing up, so I'm going to share first chapter today. So here we go. Here comes Charlie. These two very old people are the father and mother of Mr. Bucket. Their names are Grandpa Joe and Grandma Josephine. And these two very old people are the father and mother of Mrs. Bucket. Their names are Grandpa George and Grandma Georgina. This is Mr. Bucket and this is Mrs. Bucket, and Mr. and Mrs. Bucket have a small boy whose name is Charlie Bucket. This is Charlie Bucket. How do you do? How do you do? And how do you do again? He is pleased to meet you. The whole of his family, the 6 grown-ups, count them, and little Charlie Bucket lived together in a small wooden house on the edge of a great town. The house wasn't nearly large enough for so many people, and life was extremely uncomfortable for them all. There were only 2 rooms in the place altogether, and there were only 1 bed. The bed was given to the 4 old grandparents because they were so old and tired. They were so tired they never got out of it. Grandpa Joe and Grandma Josephine on this side, Grandpa George and Grandma Georgina on this side. Mr. and Mrs. Bucket and little Charlie Bucket slept in the other room, upon a mattresses on the floor. In the summertime, this wasn't too bad, but in the winter, freezing cold drafts drew across the floor all night long, and it was awful. There wasn't any question of them being able to buy a better house or even one more bed to sleep in. They were far too poor for that. Mr. Bucket was the only person in the family with a job. He worked in a toothpaste factory, where he sat all day long at a bench and screwed the little caps onto the tops of the tubes of the toothpaste after the tubes had been filled. But a toothpaste cap screwer never paid very much money, and poor Mr. Bucket, however hard he worked, and however fast he screwed on the caps, was never able to make enough to buy 1/2 of the things that so large a family needed. There wasn't even enough money to buy proper food for them all. The only meals they could afford were bread and margarine for breakfast, boiled potatoes and cabbage for lunch, and cabbage soup for supper. Sundays were a bit better. They all looked forward to Sundays because then, although they had exactly the same, everyone was allowed a second helping. The Buckets, of course, didn't starve, but every one of them, the 2 old grandfathers and 2 old grandmothers, Charlie's father, Charlie's mother, and especially little Charlie himself, went about from morning till night with a horrible empty feeling in their tummies. Charlie felt it worst of all, and although his father and mother often went without their own share of lunch or supper so they could give it to him, it wasn't nearly enough for a growing boy. He desperately wanted something more filling and satisfying than cabbage and cabbage soup. The one thing he longed for more than anything else was chocolate. Walking to school in the mornings, Charlie could see great slabs of chocolate piled up high in the shop windows, and he would stop and stare and press his nose against the glass, his mouth watering like mad. Many times a day he would see other children taking creamy candy bars out of their pockets and munching them greedily, and that, of course, was pure torture. Only once a year on his birthday did Charlie Bucket ever get to taste a bit of chocolate. The whole family saved up their money for that special occasion, and when that great day arrived, Charlie was always presented with 1 small chocolate bar to eat all by himself. And each time he received it on those marvelous birthday mornings, he would place it carefully in a small wooden box that he owned and treasured it as though it were a bar of solid gold. And for the next few days he would allow himself only to look at it, but never touch it. Then at last, when he could stand it no longer, he would peel back a tiny bit of paper wrapping at one corner to expose a tiny bit of chocolate, and then he would take a tiny nibble, just enough to allow the lovely sweet taste to spread out slowly over his tongue. The next day he would take another tiny nibble, and so on, and in this way Charlie would make his 10-cent bar of birthday chocolate last him for more than a month. But I haven't yet told you about the one awful thing that tortured little Charlie, the lover of chocolate more than anything else. This thing for him was far, far worse than seeing slabs of chocolate in the shop windows or watching other children munching creamy candy bars right in front of him. It was the most terrible, torturing thing you could imagine, and it was this. In the town itself, actually within sight of the house in which Charlie lived, there is an enormous chocolate factory. Just imagine that. And it wasn't simply an ordinary, enormous chocolate factory either. It was the largest and most famous in all the world. It was Wonka's factory, owned by a man called Willy Wonka, the greatest inventor and maker of chocolates that there has ever been. And what a tremendous, marvelous place it was. It was huge iron gates leading into it, and high walls surrounding it, and smoke belching from its chimney, and strange whizzing sounds coming from deep inside it. And outside the walls, for half a mile around in every direction, the air was scented with the heavy, rich smell of melting chocolate. Twice a day on his way to and from school, little Charlie Bucket had to walk right past the gates of the factory, and every time he went by he would begin to walk very, very slowly, and he would hold his nose high in the air and take long, deep sniffs of the gorgeous chocolatey smell all around him. Oh, how he loved that smell, and oh, how he wished he could go inside the factory and see what it was like. All right, that's the end of chapter 1. I'm going to read you the back just to give you a little bit more information. Willy Wonka's famous chocolate factory is opening at last, but only for 5 lucky children will be allowed inside, and winners are Augustus Gloop, an enormously fat boy whose hobby is eating, Veronica Salt, a spoiled, rotten brat whose parents are wrapped around her little finger, Violet Beauregard, a dim-witted gum chewer with the fastest jaws around, Mike TV, a toy pistol totting gangster in training who is obsessed with television, and Charlie Bucket, our hero, a boy who is honest, kind, brave, and true, and good and ready for the wildest time of his life. All right, if you guys are liking Boy in 6th grade, you might want to try out Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. There's also a lot of other good titles that he has written, so check them out. Hope you are all doing well and can't wait to hear what you're reading. Bye!